Thousands gathered, braving the bitter December cold, not just for justice, but for a spectacle. A massive, four-sided gallows dominated Mankato's town square, built to hang 38 men simultaneously. As the condemned Dakota men were led out, barefoot on the frozen ground, an unexpected sound filled the air, their death song, sung in unison. It was a moment of profound defiance before the final horrific act in America's largest ever mass execution. Southern Minnesota became a battleground for 1 month in 1862, from late August to late September. The catalyst occurred in Acton Township on the 17th of August, when 4 young Dakota hunters, returning from an unsuccessful hunt and arguing over stolen eggs, dared each other into confronting settlers. The confrontation escalated rapidly. By the end, 5 settlers lay dead. This localized violence detonated years of accumulated Dakota frustration, stemming from abrogated treaties and the exploitative practices of traders controlling annuity payments and provisions at the upper and lower Sioux agencies. Promised government funds and food were consistently late, insufficient, or siphoned off, leaving many Dakota facing starvation despite treaty agreements ceding vast tracts of land. The killings at Acton triggered immediate war councils. While some leaders urged caution, others, notably Dauyataduta, Little Crow, were persuaded that war was the only remaining option against perceived injustice and settler encroachment. On the 18th of August, Dakota forces struck the lower Sioux agency. Buildings were torched, traders targeted, and settlers killed or captured. The suddenness caught federal agents and settlers completely unprepared. The attacks spread quickly. Warriors assaulted the town of New Ulm twice, leading to fierce street fighting and significant destruction before being repulsed. Simultaneously, Fort Ridgely, a key military post, endured determined sieges. Defenders, a mix of U.S. Army regulars from the 5th Minnesota Infantry Regiment and civilian volunteers, utilized the fort's cannons, primarily 12-pounder mountain howitzers, to break up Dakota assaults. The speed, ferocity, and coordination of the initial Dakota offensive stunned the white population and military establishment across the region. After 1 month of intense fighting, the Dakota inflicted considerable damage across the Minnesota River Valley but failed to capture strategically vital locations. Initial successes faltered against organized defenses, particularly at Fort Ridgely, which held firm despite repeated attacks. U.S. Army units, augmented by hastily assembled state militia and local volunteers, began to consolidate their positions, reinforcing beleaguered settlements and garrisons. The crucial command fell to Colonel Henry Sibley, a former Minnesota governor with extensive experience trading and interacting with the Dakota. Sibley assembled a relief force, composed primarily of the 6th, 7th, and elements of the 9th and 10th Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Regiments, totaling over 1,600 men. Sibley's advance was cautious, hampered by inexperienced troops and logistical challenges. His objective was clear: relieve Fort Ridgely, defeat the Dakota forces, and secure the release of captured settlers. The decisive engagement occurred on the 23rd of September, 1862, at Wood Lake. Dakota forces under Little Crow planned an ambush along Sibley's line of march. However, a foraging party from Sibley's command unexpectedly stumbled upon the concealed Dakota positions, triggering the battle prematurely. Sibley deployed his infantry in disciplined lines, supported by artillery. The U.S. forces' superior numbers and firepower, particularly the accurate volleys from rifled muskets like the Springfield Model 1861 and coordinated artillery fire, proved overwhelming. Dakota warriors, primarily armed with smoothbore trade muskets, shotguns, and traditional weapons, fought fiercely but could not break the army lines. The Battle of Wood Lake lasted approximately 2 hours and ended with a clear U.S. victory, effectively shattering the Dakota military effort. It marked the final significant engagement of the war. Though Dakota resistance continued sporadically, their hope of reclaiming lost lands through force was extinguished. The strategic situation shifted dramatically. The Dakota forces fragmented. Some factions sought refuge further west, while others, led by figures advocating peace, prepared to negotiate. Colonel Sibley, his military objective achieved, focused on ending the conflict definitively. The denouement of the armed conflict centered on a location subsequently named Camp Release, near present-day Montevideo. By the final week of September 1862, after a month of warfare culminating in the defeat at Wood Lake, Dakota leaders associated with the peace faction recognized the futility of continued resistance. They initiated contact with Colonel Sibley. Sibley approached these discussions with one overriding priority: the immediate recovery of all captives taken by the Dakota since the war began on the 18th of August. The urgency stemmed from both humanitarian concern for the captives, many enduring significant hardship, and the strategic necessity of securing their safety to facilitate a peaceful surrender without further bloodshed or potential reprisal killings. Dakota warriors had taken numerous white and mixed-blood women and children hostage during raids on settlements and farms. Their liberation was non-negotiable for Sibley. On the 26th of September, 1862, Sibley marched his command, positioning his troops north of the Dakota encampment. He entered the camp and formally demanded the release of all prisoners. The Dakota leaders complied. Approximately 270 captives, predominantly women and children, were turned over to Sibley's forces. The location earned its name, Camp Release, from this prisoner exchange. The handover was fraught with complex emotions. The former captives, many having suffered immensely, experienced relief mixed with the trauma of their ordeal. Some, like Sarah Wakefield, wife of a physician, described a complicated release. Wakefield had formed a bond with her Dakota protector, Chaska, who had treated her kindly and intervened to save her life on multiple occasions during the conflict. Other released captives expressed similar ambivalence, reflecting the intricate human relationships forged even amidst violent crisis. Thomas Ireland, a settler shot 7 times during the initial attack that killed his wife, returned to the scene after his recovery. He assisted in burying 14 victims, including 3 men, 3 women, and several children. Ireland learned his daughters had been taken captive after he was wounded and his wife killed. The girls were later traded for horses. They endured 4 months of captivity before reaching safety at Fort Pierre, and were ultimately reunited with their father at Camp Release. The exchange secured the captives' freedom but marked only the cessation of open hostilities, not the resolution of the conflict's deeper issues. Although the prisoner exchange at Camp Release signaled the end of organized combat, the atmosphere remained charged. Many Dakota warriors who had participated in the fighting joined the peace faction, relying on Colonel Sibley's assurance that punishment would target only those directly responsible for civilian murders, distinguishing these acts from combat fatalities. This reliance proved precarious. For the Dakota, surrender was not a conclusion but the threshold of an uncertain future. Fear permeated the camp as warriors, women, and children awaited their fate. Conversely, for U.S. soldiers and settlers, the surrender represented the beginning of accountability, which they equated with justice. However, settlers demanded more than just cessation of hostilities. They demanded retribution. Calls for punishment intensified as accounts, often sensationalized, of atrocities committed during the war circulated widely. Colonel Sibley faced the challenge of upholding his pledge to differentiate between combatants and those guilty of murder. In the volatile climate of post-conflict Minnesota, where settler losses were significant and anger ran high, this distinction became practically impossible to maintain. Sibley's promise was tested almost immediately. Despite his assurances, the political and popular pressure for swift, harsh justice was immense. On the 28th of September, 1862, only 2 days after the prisoner exchange, Sibley established a military commission to try the Dakota men who had surrendered or been captured. This initiated one of the most rapid and controversial judicial proceedings in U.S. history. The commission comprised 5 military officers, none possessing formal legal training. Their assigned task was immense: adjudicate the cases of over 400 Dakota men concerning their roles in the preceding month's war. Over the ensuing weeks, the commission operated at remarkable speed. Trials frequently concluded within minutes. Evidence presented was often minimal, heavily reliant on hearsay, coerced testimony, or simply the defendant's presence at a battle site. By the time the commission concluded its work in early November 1862, it had tried 392 Dakota men. Of these, 303 were convicted and sentenced to death by hanging. From the Dakota perspective, the proceedings were largely incomprehensible. Most defendants did not speak English and lacked understanding of the specific charges levied against them. Interpreters were scarce and often inadequate. Cultural and linguistic barriers severely hampered the ability of the accused to mount meaningful defenses. Many were condemned solely for participation in battles, regardless of whether they committed specific atrocities. The crucial distinction Sibley had initially promised, separating acts of war from criminal acts against civilians, dissolved under the pressure for expediency and public vengeance. One particularly stark case involved the warrior Chaska. Despite testimony from Sarah Wakefield detailing how he had actively protected her and her children during the conflict, the commission disregarded her account. Chaska was convicted and sentenced to death alongside men accused of heinous acts. Minnesota settlers largely viewed the trials as a necessary conclusion. Homes had been destroyed, families killed or displaced, and communities traumatized. Public sentiment overwhelmingly favored severe measures. Governor Alexander Ramsey publicly declared that the Sioux Indians of Minnesota must be exterminated or driven forever beyond the borders of the state. His rhetoric echoed settler demands and reinforced the commission's haste. Eager to produce results, the commission functioned essentially as a conviction apparatus where guilt was often presumed. For most accused, the outcome was predetermined. Presence at a battle or raid frequently equated to a capital conviction. Colonel Sibley found himself caught between settler demands for swift punishment and his own understanding of the conflict's complexities. Knowing that the Dakota fought due to starvation and broken treaties, not malice alone. Yet the commission faced intense pressure to satisfy the white populace. The sheer number of death sentences, 303, shocked observers, including some of Sibley's own officers and officials within the federal government, setting the stage for presidential review. Here are the final 2 parts of the historical account, followed by a concise ending. Following President Lincoln's review and commutations, 39 Dakota men remained under sentence of death. They were initially held near Camp Release, before being transported 120 miles eastward to Mankato, the designated site for their execution. During their final days and the arduous journey, often made under harsh conditions and public scrutiny, the condemned men prepared themselves. Many engaged in traditional Dakota spiritual practices, chanting ancestral songs, praying for guidance, and seeking strength for the ordeal ahead. Others, including Chaska, who had converted to Christianity, sought solace through prayer, focusing on their souls and the prospect of peace in the afterlife. Chaska's case remained particularly conspicuous. His documented actions in protecting Sarah Wakefield stood in stark contrast to his condemnation, highlighting the complexities and potential injustices overlooked by the military commission. Among the others slated for execution were known war leaders and warriors accused of specific acts against settlers, such as Tatanka, implicated in the killing of women and children, and Heinka, accused in attacks on settlers. Tamina, noted for battlefield leadership, was also among the condemned. Tauyataduta, Little Crow, a primary leader during the war, had evaded capture and was not among those tried or condemned by the commission at this time. The condemned men were denied final farewells with their families, many of whom were concurrently held in separate internment camps awaiting removal. The 265 Dakota men whose death sentences Lincoln had commuted to imprisonment were also awaiting transport, facing an uncertain future at Camp McClellan, a military prison near Davenport, Iowa. Uncertainty clouded the fate of all Dakota prisoners, whether they faced indefinite imprisonment or eventual release, and what conditions or homelands, if any, they might return to remained unknown. Confusion, fear, and profound insecurity gripped the Dakota community. As late December 1862 enveloped Mankato in winter weather, preparations advanced for an unprecedented event, the largest simultaneous mass execution in United States history. Public executions historically often drew crowds, blending grim spectacle with perceived justice. Hanging 39 men at once was logistically complex and without precedent, drawing intense public interest. Mankato swelled with onlookers eager to witness the event. A palpable undercurrent of mixed anticipation, grief, and unease settled over the town as the date approached. The 39 condemned Dakota arrived, and their execution was scheduled for the 26th of December, 1862, the day after Christmas. In the final hours, a directive arrived from President Lincoln, a reprieve for one man. Having specifically reviewed the case details, Lincoln ordered Chaska removed from the execution list, acknowledging his role in safeguarding Sarah Wakefield. This last-minute act of executive clemency reduced the number to be hanged to 38. The morning of the 26th of December, 1862, dawned cold over Mankato. Snow covered the ground. A crowd estimated in the thousands, men, women, and children, converged on the town square. The area had been transformed into a grim public stage. Dominating the center was a massive square wooden scaffold, specifically engineered for the simultaneous execution. No known photographs exist, leaving contemporary newspaper sketches as the primary visual records. These illustrations depict a raised platform with upright timbers forming a square frame above it. Ropes, 38 nooses, hung at regular intervals from these overhead beams. The design oriented the condemned outwards on all four sides, ensuring visibility for the surrounding crowd regardless of their vantage point. The structure incorporated a mechanism, likely involving cutting a single primary rope, designed to release the platform supports simultaneously, allowing all 38 individuals to drop at the same instant. The 38 condemned Dakota men ascended the steps to the platform. They wore simple clothing. Many were barefoot despite the freezing temperatures. Eyewitness accounts described them moving with composure. As they reached the platform, an unexpected sound arose. The prisoners began chanting their death songs in unison. These traditional Dakota chants, expressions of spiritual conviction and courage, carried over the murmurings of the assembled crowd. Some observers reported being struck by the profound, unsettling nature of the songs. The atmosphere reportedly shifted, imbued with a sense of gravity exceeding mere punitive justice. The event, anticipated by many as a final judgment, took on an unexpected, somber character. As the 38 men were positioned along the four edges of the scaffold, the prepared nooses were placed around their necks. They remained outwardly composed. Below, the crowd watched in silence. Upon a signal given by Captain William Dooley, whose family had suffered losses in the conflict, the rope holding the platform's trapdoor mechanism was cut. The platform fell away, and the 38 bodies dropped simultaneously. A collective gasp or cry arose from the spectators. For a brief moment, an intense quiet followed the execution. Among the witnesses was Thomas Ireland, the settler whose wife was killed and daughters captured early in the war. He, like others, likely watched in silence as officials began the task of cutting down the bodies of the executed men. Following the execution, the large crowd dispersed from the Mankato town square, carrying with them a mixture of reactions. Some undoubtedly felt satisfaction, believing justice, or at least vengeance, had been served. Others likely felt conflicted, having sought retribution but perhaps unprepared for the stark reality of the mass hanging they had witnessed. Figures like Bishop Henry Whipple maintained their belief that the trials were deeply flawed and that some of the executed men were innocent of capital crimes. For the Dakota people, the execution marked not an end, but the intensification of a devastating period of displacement and loss. In the war's aftermath, over 2,000 Dakota non-combatants, mostly women, children, and the elderly, were rounded up and confined in hastily constructed internment camps within Minnesota, most notably a large camp near Fort Snelling through the harsh winter of 1862-1863. Conditions in these camps were often deplorable, leading to widespread disease and death. The 265 warriors spared execution by Lincoln began their journey to prison in Iowa. Their fate, along with those in the Minnesota camps, remained uncertain, but the prospect of returning to their ancestral homes appeared non-existent. Governor Alexander Ramsey's stated goal, that the Sioux must be exterminated or driven forever beyond the borders of the state, moved closer to realization, specifically its latter part. In early 1863, the United States government formally abrogated all treaties with the Dakota in Minnesota and initiated the process of forcibly removing nearly all Dakota people from the state, regardless of their involvement in the war. They were transported via steamboat and overland routes to desolate reservations, first to Crow Creek in what is now South Dakota, an arid land unsuitable for agriculture, where starvation and disease continued to claim lives, and later to the Santee Reservation in Nebraska. This forced expulsion represented the culmination of settler pressure and government policy aimed at extinguishing Dakota land claims in Minnesota. The end of the Dakota War in Minnesota did not signify peace on the northern plains. Instead, it prompted further military action. Following the pattern established after other conflicts with Native American nations, the U.S. Army launched punitive expeditions in 1863 and 1864 into Dakota Territory. Led by Generals Henry Sibley and Alfred Sully, these campaigns sought to punish Dakota bands who had moved west, including some who had participated in the 1862 war and others who had not. These expeditions resulted in battles such as Big Mound, Dead Buffalo Lake, Stony Lake, and Whitestone Hill, often targeting villages and destroying winter supplies, further displacing Sioux populations. These campaigns also inadvertently drew the U.S. military into wider conflicts with other Lakota Sioux groups, who had not been involved in the Minnesota Uprising, contributing to the escalating warfare across the northern plains that would continue for decades. It was during these post-1862 campaigns that Army forces increasingly encountered resistance figures who would become prominent in later Plains Wars, including the Hunkpapa Lakota leader Sitting Bull. The Minnesota conflict, born of specific local grievances, thus transitioned into a broader, protracted struggle over land and sovereignty across the West. The Mankato execution and subsequent Dakota expulsion closed a violent chapter fueled by broken promises and cultural collision. It cleared Minnesota lands for settlement, but left a painful legacy of injustice and displacement, simultaneously igniting wider conflicts across the northern plains that would shape the course of westward expansion.